Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Brad Biggerstaff. I'm the associate pastor here at Asbury United Methodist Church, and I'm the moderator for this afternoon's forum, Pathways to Peace, Are Nuclear Weapons Necessary Today? We at Asbury welcome you to our space and welcome those online to our YouTube page. For those of us here in person, we want to remind you at the outset to silence your cell phones. And we also want you to know that we have note cards. Many of you have been handed them already. And that if you have questions for our question period, you can go ahead and write those out, hold on to those cards, and then right as we set up for our question period later, after our four speakers present, we'll have runners come and grab the cards, and they will bring them over to Pastor Kathy. If you're online with us, you are welcome to put questions in the chat box. Pastor Kathy will curate those questions there, and we'll use them for question time as well. Back in late March, I'm sure we were all glued to the news, keeping track of what was going on with the Russian military buildup on the border of Ukraine. I know that I was. I was back home in Nashville, Tennessee, when I was scrolling Twitter and saw that the invasion of Ukraine had begun. Like many, I followed Twitter and social media and the news for updates for many days, and I was impressed by Ukrainian resolve. But when I returned back here to Livermore, heightened global rhetoric surrounding nuclear weapon use had my mind spinning with many questions. This was where Pastor Kathy and Livermore Indivisible and myself got together to birth this forum. For many born in the last few decades, like myself, this is the first time in our lives that the threat of nuclear weapon use has felt very real. This forum felt especially important because Livermore, California, has a long history and connection to nuclear weapon development through the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and Sandia National Laboratories just down the street that way. This forum draws on that history while equipping new generations like myself to answer the question, are nuclear weapons necessary today? Before I introduce our speakers, though, I want to take a quick moment to thank Livermore Indivisible for co-sponsoring this event with Asbury today. And I want to thank our committee of Alan Burnham, Helen Machunga, Christine Kansa, and Heather Hammer, who worked tirelessly to put this together. I also want to thank Kirby Fong and Kevin Stankiewicz and Cameron David for helping with the audio and visual, and Pastor Kathy LaPointe-Collop for curating our questions for this forum. Lastly, I want to thank Ellen Schwartz and Karen Bauman for helping with refreshments that will be available for us following the forum. Finally, before we begin, I want to introduce our four speakers who are on stage here, and then we will dive right on in. Dr. George Miller will be speaking to us this evening about nuclear deterrence as a path to peace. Dr. Miller was the 10th director of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, a position he assumed in March 2006 after a long and distinguished career in national security work at the laboratory. Dr. Miller also has a PhD in physics from the College of William and Mary. Dr. Ron Lehman is with us today to speak about nuclear arms reduction as a path to peace. He was director of the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency when the START I, START II, and Conventional Forces in Europe treaties, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Open Skies Agreement, the Joint Verification Experiment, and the Protocol to the Threshold Test Ban Treaty and other historic agreements were concluded. Ron has served in the Defense Department as Assistant Secretary for International Security Policy, in the State Department as Ambassador and U.S. Chief Negotiator on Offensive Arms, and on the National Security Council staff. Ron served as the chairman of the DoD Threat Reduction Advisory Committee from 2013 to 2019, and Ron is currently counselor to the director at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. But he today is speaking only for himself and not any other organization in which he is or was associated. We also have Father George Griener with us this afternoon to speak about just war theory as a path to peace. Father Griener is the Associate Professor Emeritus of Historical and Systematic Theology at Jesuit School of Theology, which is a part of Santa Clara University. Father Griener was also connected with Pax Christi Germany in the mid-1980s, with Pax Christi USA since 1983, and was founder of Pax Christi Berkeley in 1889. Lastly, Reverend 1989, my apologies. Lots of words here. Lastly, Reverend Joanna Shank is with us today to speak about religious pacifism as a path to peace. Reverend Shank is the Associate Pastor of First Mennonite Church of San Francisco. She is the author of the books Widening the Circle, Experiments in Christian Discipleship, and The Movement Makes Us Human, an interview with Dr. Vincent Harding on Mennonites, Vietnam, and MLK. Reverend Shank is also the co-producer of the Iconoclast podcast, which is currently on hiatus, which includes interviews with Noah Chomsky, Robert Ellsberg, Rita Nakashima Brock, and Sarah Miles. She also works part-time with Faith in Action Bay Area as an organizer of faith communities, focusing especially on economic inequality, housing justice, and immigration advocacy. She also helps to coordinate the Dismantling Christian Hegemony Network, and Reverend Shank is a graduate of Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary with an MA in Theological Studies. Can we all take a moment to welcome our four speakers? And now we kick this afternoon off, and I welcome Dr. George Miller.
Great, thank you all very much. If I could have just the title slide. We all have a really hard job today, which is condensing literally centuries of discourse into 10 minutes and trying to make it coherent. I will tell you ahead of time that I will violate one of the admonitions of one of my mentors, in which he said, the last refuge of a scoundrel is appealing to higher authority. So I'm going to appeal to higher authority today. If I could have the first slide, please. So the slide is just the title slide. As I said, deterrence and all of the subjects we're going to be talking about today have been around a very long time. These are two quotes from quite some time ago that are frequently used as we talk about the subject of deterrence. And it's also important to note that modern deterrence theory really relies on the work of Thomas Schelling, who is a Nobel Prize-winning economist, and Herman Kahn. They all share, I guess I would say, the common theme that the way to prepare for peace is by creating war-fighting capabilities. And all of the inconsistencies and incongruities that resolve around that particular point of view. Next slide, please. The central deterrence, we frequently talk about nuclear deterrence, and that is part of the beginning of the problem, in that deterrence is a very broad subject, all of the parts of which are intimately intertwined. Military, economic, diplomatic, and a lot of different pieces like declaratory policy, denial and punishment. So there's a lot of complicated nature to the nature of deterrence, and they're all connected. And in particular, they're connected not only within the United States, but with respect to how our adversaries may see their differences, their advantages, and their strengths. In reality, deterrence, because we all hope to avoid war, is about shaping perceptions such that the alternatives to war are more attractive than actually beginning war. Next slide. The principle of U.S. deterrence is really providing the president with multiple options. That's done through the declaratory policy, which is purposefully ambiguous, using interpretable words like extreme circumstances and vital interests, targeting what the enemy's leadership values, and having delivery platforms with differing characteristics. Again, one of the difficulties in this conversation is that people generally enter the conversation talking about the policies that were initiated by Eisenhower in the 50s, which are frequently called mutual assured destruction or massive retaliation. Those were changed in 1960 by President Kennedy and largely remained changed ever since. So it's important that we talk about what is as opposed to what used to be or what we might think things are. So I'd like to say just a couple of words maybe to provide some common ground on facts before I get into more opinion-like. Next slide. The U.S. nuclear forces are a triad configured to ensure the ability to retaliate while complicating an adversary's planning and minimizing risks and of providing that flexibility to the president. So it consists of bombers, ground-based, submarine-based, nuclear command and control, and a small number of what we call non-strategic. Again, in this context, strategic is defined, roughly speaking, as the distance between the United States and Russia. That's strategic. Anything that's shorter distance is somehow non-strategic, even though to Germany, non-strategic may be very strategic. So the words are often confusing. I think it's also important to note that irrespective of the characterization, the current program of the United States where nuclear weapons are concerned largely just recreates the capability of the Cold War. Our former Congresswoman, Ellen Tauscher, often described that as modernizing a 1950 Ford. So they're largely the same from a military point of view. Next slide. This provides a little bit of context of the history of the United States stockpile. Again, large increases starting in the 50s, following large decreases starting in the 70s and 80s. One of the important parts of this is to note that the U.S. stockpile went up by 6,000 weapons in 1 year and down by 5,000 weapons in 1 year. And one of the things that is of import today is that we're roughly at a few thousand warheads. Again, the size of the stockpile is inherently unstable because adversaries can increase the size of their stockpile fairly rapidly with respect to what we are. In fact, if you look at this in another coordinate system, the size and destructive power of today's stockpile is roughly the same as what we had in 1955. So there have been a lot of changes over time. Next slide. Again, if you look at the stockpile in aggregate, there's roughly 3,000 weapons. That includes a lot of things that are not operationally deployed. The operationally deployed stockpile is about half of that. If you look at how many are on alert at any one day, that's roughly, again, half of that. And today, as a result of decisions that past presidents have made, none of the warheads are actually targeted today. So, for instance, the missiles and the submarines are targeted on the broad ocean areas. And in order to make them employable, you actually have to upload the targeting information. Next slide. I think it's important, and we've begun seeing some of this, as Brad mentioned in the introduction, that the problem of strategic deterrence today is very different than the problem that we dealt with in the Cold War. We are largely facing regional conflicts, regional initially conventional conflicts against nuclear-armed adversaries. Those adversaries are actually trying to upset and in many respects remake the world order that the United States helped create based on the rule of law after World War II. Deterrence has always been integrated across multiple domains, but today, the fact that it's integrated across space and cyber and conventional, it's multi-domains, multi-timescales, multi-regions, and I think it's fair to say if you read the literature of our adversaries, they have come to the conclusion that they can outcompete the U.S., primarily because of questions of will. Next slide. This is one way of projecting the Russian approach to deterrence. And I'm sorry for the size of it, I couldn't make it any bigger. But if you look at it, virtually throughout the entire spectrum of conflict, the Russians have involved nuclear weapons. In fact, if you look closely, you'll see the first three have already been exercised by Mr. Putin in the war on the Ukraine. Again, signaling, mobilization, and heightened alerts. Those are all things that Mr. Putin has already done with his nuclear forces. So this actually, the good news where the Russians are concerned is there's a lot of literature to evaluate about what the Russian approach is. And so we have a fairly good idea of what the state is. Next slide. In many respects, the U.S. has shown restraint. Since the end of the Cold War, we have kept our nuclear forces very stable. We've decreased them. The capability that we are putting in place today is, as I said, is virtually the same as what we had before. That's not the case either in the case of Russia or in the case of China. So these are two quotes, one from the commander of U.S. Stratcom, who is the Defense Department official responsible for nuclear weapons, another from our colleague Brad Roberts, who's written extensively on these subjects. And again, I think Brad's comment is particularly poignant. It says, while the U.S. and its allies looked at counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, Russia and China innovated to counter U.S. power projection and U.S.-backed regional orders. And I think that is the case. Last slide. And so when I look at this, it basically tells me that nuclear weapons in today's world have unique and so far irreplaceable functions. Our adversaries have them. They have decided that nuclear weapons are incredibly important to their strategic security, to the plans that they have. And in dealing with the world as it is, it's important to understand that nuclear weapons are a part of that, whether we like it or not. Again, just to reiterate, the purposes of nuclear weapons remain to ensure that an adversary sees unacceptable cost and incalculable risk. They are able to signal resolve without employment, to demonstrate the ability to respond at any level of escalation should it get to that. Importantly, to reassure our allies, to provide stability, and really to ensure that the U.S. understands and can manage the risks of engaging internationally. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the questions from Brad and others.
And now we want to welcome Dr. Ron Lehman.
Thank you, Brad. I'm very pleased to be here. I'd rather be in the audience.
Is that his mic? Yeah, okay.
Well, there you have it.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. Okay. Thanks, Brad. I'm very pleased to be here. Although I would rather be in the audience listening to the other three speakers. But Brad told me that if I spoke, I could take my mask off. And so there is at least one advantage to being a speaker. I was asked to highlight the successes and failures of arms control in the nuclear age, and to also speculate on the future of nuclear weapons, and to do it all in 10 minutes. I think with the help of the other speakers and with some discussion, I think we can at least prime the pump for what should be a really good discussion of a changed world and the new challenges that we face. I am speaking only for myself, but I have to say it is, Brad, very appropriate that we're here in Livermore on East Avenue, a few blocks from two national laboratories that have contributed so much to the arms control accomplishments of the nuclear age. To avoid any confusion, I should probably begin by explaining what I mean when I say arms control. Often we give arms control a narrow definition, which says it's kind of the regulation and limitation of existing arms. But sometimes we use arms control as kind of an umbrella phrase for all of the treaties that not only limit but eliminate nuclear weapons or any other weapons and arms, for the verification and inspection approaches and strategies, for confidence building measures such as advance notification of exercises, of launches of missiles, data exchanges. And I would broaden it even beyond that to include not only policy declarations, but also international and domestic law, even canon law. And I would add that even areas of what I will call enlightened self-restraint can fall under the tools that are available. Now you may ask, well, why would I want the broad definition as opposed to a more precise, narrow definition? And the answer is, I understand each of them is different, but actually to be successful, we had to use all of them together, and they each built upon the other. I should also clarify what I mean by the nuclear age. You were a very nice reading list of excellent works was circulated, I believe, to many of you. And the books and articles on there are excellent. Paul Bracken writes about the second nuclear age, and he focuses on terrorism, rogue states, today's Russia. The foreign affairs articles focus on a new nuclear age, and in particular highlight the military and nuclear buildup in China, which surprised many experts. And David Cooper writes about arms control in the third nuclear age, and highlighting the fact that so many of the weapons of mass destruction capabilities and technologies have advanced and spread widely around the world. And they're all right. We're in a new phase. It may be as dangerous a phase potentially as we've ever experienced. On the other hand, I come from a slightly different perspective, because I tend to refer to the nuclear age, because we've never really escaped the shadow of nuclear weapons. Even over the last few decades, when we often put nuclear deterrence and modernization on the back burner, well, we put arms control, concrete arms control, on the back burner too. We focused on other things. And but that didn't mean nuclear weapons went away. They were still there. They still have influence, as we're seeing the way they're being used without being launched in the context of the Ukrainian crisis. And because we don't know how to disinvent nuclear weapons, I don't know when the nuclear age ends. But I do know that it has ups and downs, and that I do know that we've had some successes and we've had some loss of successes. And so I'd like to focus on that. And so, like your authors, I'm going to try to break it up into 3 periods and then concentrate on one in the middle. The early period of arms control in the nuclear age began almost immediately, within a few months of the first nuclear detonations and the end of World War II, when the three nuclear powers got together at the head of government, head of state level, and announced that they wanted to have international control of nuclear power and to eliminate nuclear weapons. Who were the three nuclear powers? Well, they were the three in the Manhattan Project: the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada. Interestingly enough, many grand proposals for universal disarmament, including conventional arms, were proposed. But as the process proceeded, by the way, usually in a large United Nations context, but as there were some successes, but as people watched, it became clear that it was becoming more and more important for the potential adversaries themselves to deal with their special problems together face to face. And so we began to see some exploration of that interaction. And that's why, another reason why it's really very important to remember the role of Livermore in that process. So for example, when President Eisenhower decided to have a conference on the possibility of surprise attacks after Sputnik, and to deal with the issue of could you have a cessation or ban on nuclear weapons testing in the atmosphere, who did he select to go? Well, E.O. Lawrence, for whom Lawrence Livermore is named. And who did Lawrence take with him to Geneva for the arms negotiations? Well, a young 20-somethings physicist who became the third director of our laboratory, Harold Brown, who was Secretary of Defense when the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks number 2, SALT II, were signed. But prior to that, we had had SALT I, and also negotiation of a threshold test ban treaty. And who was on that delegation? Well, it was the fifth director of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, Mike May. When I first started going to Geneva, I met with the comprehensive test ban delegation, not the one from the 90s, but the one in the 70s. They were trilateral. The French and the Chinese would not participate, so it was just the British, the Americans, and the Soviets. And who was the head of the American delegation? Herb York. And who was Herb York? He was the first director of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. So Livermore has been in the middle of all of this. While the success of those early engagements was uneven, I think it's important to stress that a lot of our great achievements were built upon those early efforts. We exploited some of the mechanisms. In my own negotiations, I often transformed things that were meant in one context to make them into a useful tool to negotiate restraints in a different context. But what I really want to focus on is what some people have called the golden decade in arms control, really between 1983 and 1993, sort of from one of the heights of the Cold War to what some people think was the end of the Cold War. And the centerpiece of that was probably the Treaty on Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Much of that was about the controversy over the deployment of NATO's INF missiles to respond to the Soviet deployment earlier of the SS-20 intermediate range ballistic missiles. Because Europe had become very insecure, they felt Russia, the Soviet Union, was becoming much more aggressive. This was after the invasion of Afghanistan. It was when they were doing a lot of saber rattling against their own allies in the Warsaw Pact. And people were very nervous. And so the decision was made under the Carter administration and implemented under the Reagan administration to deploy these INF missiles. And it was a very tense time. Some people think it was one of the most tense times in the Cold War. I think maybe not quite so tense, but still very serious. Having said that, the INF Treaty solved the geopolitical problem because it reinforced both the will of the Allies to deploy and do what needed to be done, but to do so in a manner in which we were offering restraint, and we achieved it with a treaty that actually banned, and we had the actual elimination of a range of missiles in two separate categories of intermediate range forces. I actually flipped the switch that signaled the instructions to destroy the last Pershing II missile down in Texas. They were actually all eliminated. And the INF Treaty was very important for another reason, because it pushed verification and inspection far beyond anything that had ever been achieved before in arms control. And that opened the door for the START I treaty that I helped negotiate, and the START II treaty, which I worked very hard on. And those treaties were very successful because with that kind of verification and with the kind of trust we were beginning to develop and the discussion of what is in the interests of all the parties, we were able to create structures that created more stable forces. And while we often talked about reductions, the answer is reductions are not necessarily good, and at very low levels, they can create real instabilities. And so if you're going to go down to low levels, you have to have confidence and verification, but you also have to have robust force structures that are not vulnerable to sudden changes in developments. So the INF Treaty was a tremendous success. But there are some lessons to be learned for today from the INF Treaty experience. At the time, people were reminded that the INF systems being destroyed carried warheads that were only a small fraction of the stockpiles of the countries involved. They were not very significant compared to the strategic forces that were involved in the START talks. And yet I would remind everybody that the missiles we actually physically destroyed carried more warheads than the ballistic missiles that we deploy today. So in that sense, it was significant. But it also reminded us that with both INF and START and subsequent agreements, we've actually never dealt with the warheads themselves. We've had accountable limits to limit operationally deployed. We've had some sampling of deployed warheads, but we've never been able to get a handle on the non-strategic, with one exception, INF, and with the non-deployed systems that are in the stockpile. That remains a major challenge, and it will require really interesting advances in verification technology. But let me remind you of the next most important lesson, I think, from the golden decade, and that is it wasn't just about nuclear. In fact, a key element of the negotiations that permitted success were the conventional armed forces in Europe treaties. And I have a slide, but you can't read it, but maybe they can put it up. But that upper slide, which you can't read, is a list of all the countries involved and all their tanks, armored personnel carriers or armored combat vehicles, helicopters, aircraft, all of the things that were being negotiated and limited, not only in numbers, but in local locations around Europe, in order to help prevent the conventional wars that could escalate to become nuclear war. And people need to understand that arms control can't just address the nuclear and forget the rest. It has to address the entire situation. It has to be holistic. And it also provided for, again, lots of inspections. So I'd like to concentrate on two negotiations that I was involved in that were prior to INF, and they weren't exactly nuclear, but they have a lot of lessons for today, and they were incredibly important, and most people have never even heard of them. One was the hotline upgrade negotiation. And when we went to Moscow, my first trip with the delegation to Moscow, the Russians, the Soviets in Moscow would not let us even talk about the use of the hotline improvements for tension reduction, confidence building, risk reduction. And there was a reason that we were deploying the NATO missiles, They had a massive influence and disinformation campaign aimed primarily at Europe, but also at the rest of the world. And tension was a tool for them. So to be saying that it's all relaxed now because we're negotiating these measures was not in their interest as they saw it. 4 years, 5 years later, we not only got the hotline upgrade, but we also got the Nuclear Risk Reduction Center, which were the things we had proposed. But we couldn't get in them until we had deployed the INF missiles. And I had a meeting that became somewhat famous or infamous with a very senior Soviet foreign ministry official who later became their foreign minister. And he told me, and the story leaked, that they might agree to the deployment of some NATO INF missiles. And when the story broke, it was totally misunderstood as to what the conversation actually all been about. What he said was, we will never, ever, ever acquiesce in the deployment of the missiles. We are going to create as much political difficulty for you as we can. We want you to pay the highest political price possible. But we know you're going to be successful. And after you've deployed the missiles, he said, who knows, maybe a few cruise missiles in Great Britain. That was the real conversation. I say that because you need to understand that arms control is influenced by the wider environment in which, so to some degree, some of the most important things you can do in arms control are not only preparing for the negotiations, but shaping the world situation to make it favorable. And let me give you one example on that. And that was the Stockholm talks on confidence and security building measures. NATO and the US were very nervous about entering those talks because NATO was divided because we hadn't yet deployed the INF missiles, and our domestic politics were divided. Allies had different positions. We all looked like we couldn't get our act together. The second group of countries that were going to participate were the neutral and non-aligned. And the general expectation was that from them, when they are negotiating about things that they don't care about, or they don't think they have a vital interest, they are at best morally neutral. They do moral equivalence. And at worst, they get in the way and they mess things up. And the third assumption was that the East would be absolutely rock solid. The Soviets would keep every Warsaw Pact country on point. Every one of those assumptions turned out to be fundamentally wrong. NATO, precisely because it had to get its act together in order to deploy the missiles, came up with some very good strategies, figured out what it was doing, united, and was strong. Secondly, the Soviets made a mistake. They wanted to put limits on the mobilization of reserve forces. But the Western democracies and the neutral and non-aligned rely on the mobilization of their citizens if they're attacked. And so the neutral and non-aligned supported the Western position, which caught the East by surprise. But the third was the East, and that was maybe the most important. This was the period of Zapad 81, where a solidarity movement was developing in Poland. And under previous agreements, under Helsinki, the Soviets were required to notify exercises over a certain period of size. And suddenly, they were conducting these massive military exercises around Poland. And their answer to us was, this isn't one big exercise, this is a bunch of little exercises. So we don't have to report it. But it was their way of telling the Poles, we're watching you, and we may come in. This may be Hungary or Czechoslovakia again. But what we discovered was, in the East, there was an interest in having Western observers at their exercises because they thought it might give them a bit more political wiggle room. I mention this because, obviously, the opening up of different ways of protecting your future were important, and arms control contributed. So the point I want to make is we have some serious problems today. I could go through a long list, then there's a list up there, of agreements and explain how was it that the Threshold Test Ban Treaty that had been moribund for years and Congress, the Senate would not act on it. Neither hawks nor doves liked it for different reasons. How, because we did the joint verification experiment, again with the lab's help, scientist to scientist, designer to designer, we were able to get a verification protocol that resulted in the Senate approving that treaty 98 to nothing. Right now, it's hard to imagine recreating the success we had in that decade. There are a lot of lessons learned that we can talk about, but there are some things that have changed. And let me highlight one, which is the Soviets violated a number of agreements, sometimes quite seriously, but they generally tried to cover it up or find a legal way to say, no, that's not what the treaty means, this is what the treaty means. And we would try to work that out. What's shocking today is that vandalizing agreements and norms seems to be becoming a way in which these WMD armed kleptocratic dictatorships in various parts of the world signal and bully. It's how they get their message across. We had thought when we negotiated the Chemical Weapons Convention that we had dealt with something that everybody thought was abhorrent. And to see citizens of North Korea and of Russia assassinated in foreign countries using advanced chemical agents must cause you to ask, what are we dealing with here? So, the good news is we have had success before. There are lessons we can apply. We may be successful again. But it isn't going to be easy because we've got to get back to some of the basics in terms of shaping the way the world is organized and acts now. These people who are vandalizing norms can vandalize them faster than we can create them. We don't need to feed them. We need to get them to understand that they have to change their behavior. It's the behavior that matters. So let me stop there.
And now we welcome Father George Griener.
Let me see here. There we go. Oh, no wonder. 2 masks. Okay. All right. All right. Well, thank you very much. We were privileged to see part of Ron's negotiating skills right from the outset. He would talk if he could take his mask off. That's the start of negotiation between Brad and Ron. So thank you very much for having done that. That was an insight into the ongoing strategy of negotiation. I would like to put up the first slide, please. Let's see, the second slide, I guess it is. It's the first. You don't see any slides? I sent them to, okay, all right. I had sent them to, okay, that's fine. There is a line from the Roman general Publius Flavius Vegetius Renatus, if you want peace, prepare for war. That was back in about 380 AD. In 1972, Pope Paul VI said, if you want peace, do the works of justice. And there's a significant shift from that ancient assumption that if you want peace, prepare for war, to, I would say, a position that has taken place in the last 60 years in Roman Catholicism about the just war theory. And there have been significant shifts that I'd like to highlight because this theory of the just war has not been a stable, univocal theory throughout the period of time. It's an ongoing, evolving issue. And by the way, if theory is not your cup of tea, this is time for a nap. Okay. There have been shifts in the Roman Catholic thinking of the social framework over the last 60 years. One is growing appreciation for international collaboration beyond national interests. Support for the United Nations, for example. Traditional just war theory focused really on the independence of an individual state. So we have to kind of consider that as an ongoing, one of the elements that have shifted over the last 2,000 years. There's been a deeper awareness of global economic and social inequities that have shaped the last 100 years in Roman Catholic thinking, which have also had a play on the notion of just war. There's a growing awareness of the savagery of war, World War I, the war to end all wars, and then the shock of the Second World War. An even deeper appreciation of the dignity and worth of the human person. This has developed since the late 18th century, more and more concern about human rights, human conscience, and it has affected Roman Catholic theology first in no longer authorizing capital punishment. At one time, Roman Catholic theology saw capital punishment as legitimate and moral. That is not the case today. There's been a shift, and that's been partly because of an appreciation of the dignity of the human being. It's also had an impact on the rhetoric of just war theory, that shift in this appreciation of the dignity of individuals. Finally, in Roman Catholic theology, there's been a shift from focus on simply membership in the church to a question of Christian discipleship and biblical ethics. And there's been a real reawakening of what does it take to be a Christian disciple. And I think as a result, Christian just war theory can be characterized as the long, deliberate struggle to hold in tension two gospel mandates: love one's enemies, protect one's neighbors. Both of them are in the Sermon on the Mount. They appear both in Matthew's version and in Luke's version. And for the Christian, loving your neighbor, loving your enemy is a mandate. It's a gospel mandate, just as protecting your neighbor is. And as a result, this tension of bringing together these two gospel mandates for the disciple renders this tension between how does one engage in warfare. Prior to Constantine, probably up to the middle of the 4th century, it was assumed that Christians could not take part in warfare, partly because Christianity was still banned in the Roman Empire, but partly because it was still very closely rooted in the biblical ethics. This changed with Constantine and the Edict of Constantine, which made Christianity kind of the state religion. And as a result, there was a differing attitude about how Christians relate to the state. So during the 5th century, it was St. Augustine, who begins to develop an idea of what we consider today just war theory, rooted in part in his City of God and many of his homilies and sermons. It would be later developed in the 13th century by Thomas Aquinas, a major Catholic thinker who was teaching at the University of Paris. So I'd like to go, and the person who most influenced just war theory in the United States would have been the Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. So I'm not talking about just war as an international law issue. I'm talking about it as a theological, moral issue as a Christian disciple. Just so I'm not trying to interact either with Ron or George. We're talking about kind of a different cup of tea here. We're dealing with a different kettle of fish. What is interesting to remember is that Augustine and Aquinas lived when emperors, kings, and princes were the political heads of state. It was before the invention of gunpowder and firearms in the 14th century, before the emergence of modern nation states in the 19th, before weapons of mass destruction and the nuclear age in the 20th. So there's been need across the centuries to continue to adjust that just war theory to adjust to very different political and social circumstances, and also in terms of the reach of what we would consider today just war. For Augustine, following the injunction of the gospel, the Christian did not enjoy the right of self-defense. For Augustine, that was a violation of the gospel. There was nevertheless the need to protect and defend one's neighbor. So war was seen as this tragic outcome of sin, but war was also the tragic remedy for sin by punishing the aggressor. And we see this in Augustine's works. What Augustine was never able to reconcile was the moral dilemma between loving and killing someone else. How do you love them and kill them at the same time? So it's very clear that for Augustine, this became an unresolvable tension. Thomas Aquinas is in the 13th century. He's influenced by a much more positive thinker, Aristotle. And for Aristotle, there is a reason to things. There's a common good. There's an appreciation of human reason. And Thomas Aquinas was able to begin to think about human activities not always as sinful, which was very typical of Augustine, but having a good goal, a good end. So Thomas Aquinas treats the question of war and just war theory under the larger title of sins against charity. You go to his Summa, the Secunda Secundae, and you say, oh, okay, he's treating war under the question of sin. And the question he asks is it always sinful to fight, to go to war? Utrum bellare semper sit peccatum. And he says, it is not always sinful, but there are three conditions. It has to be a just cause, it has to be authorized by a legal head of state, and it has to achieve good ends. It has to intend good things. So rather than seeing just war as a carte blanche for the legitimation of war, the theory attempted to restrict and limit the use of war, narrowing the conditions when the use of arms could be justified. And we see that throughout Thomas's work. There are, nevertheless, if we look back over the last 600 or 700 years, there are probably several criteria which emerge broadly that fits under this schema of just war. One would be a just cause, could be the common good, could be the restoration of peace, it could be righting a wrong. So it had to be a just cause. It had to be a decision by a competent civil authority. Now, at the time of Augustine and Aquinas, the assumption was the head of state had divine authority. We still say Queen Elizabeth, by the grace of God, Queen of England. So the assumption was there was divine authority giving that head of state power. Today in democracies, we don't speak like that. We don't take for granted that an authority has that power. There has to be right intention in waging war, truly seeking the restoration of peace. That would be the third condition. The fourth would be the exhaustion of all possible alternatives. Has everything really been tried? Fifth, the probability of success in achieving the good of the restoration of peace. If it looks like a lost cause, then that really wouldn't qualify to go to war. The principle of proportionality. The good intended outweighs the damage to be inflicted in achieving that good. So these 6 conditions: just cause, competent authority, right intention, exhaustion of all possible alternatives, the probability of success, and the principle of proportionality. The theory also spoke of the principle of discrimination, distinguishing between those directly engaged in conducting the war and those who were not. That is, protecting the immunity of non-combatant or innocent civilians. So that proportionality requirement was, if they're not actually fighting the war, you can't kill them. We're seeing this right now in Ukraine when there are crimes of war because innocent citizens are being killed. Now that distinction of protecting the innocents might have had foundation when warring armies often fought their battles on a battlefield. And this was often the case. You would go to war not in the middle of a city, but you'd go to war in some field. And we still have monuments dedicated to where wars were fought. Difficulty was with the introduction of aerial bombing as early as 1914 in World War I, strategic bombing of cities during World War II, firebombing, that of Dresden or Tokyo, the use of rockets, V2, to deliver explosive devices. It rendered that distinction between the competent and the non-competent very problematic. How can you preserve the question of the protecting the innocent civilian? So this indiscriminate bombing of cities became a very difficult problem for just war theorists to deal with. And then, of course, the use of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing instantly 80,000 in one case, 40,000 in the other, became problematic. Reinhold Niebuhr, who would be the father of American just war theory, at least modern 20th century, he could see bombing cities, but he drew the line at the atomic bomb. Once that atomic bomb was released, Reinhold Niebuhr says, we have come as bad as the enemy. We are no longer morally above the enemy itself. So after World War II, Christian leaders began to raise serious questions about the acceptance of war as a necessary but unavoidable resolution of grievances. In 1963, in his letter to Pacem in Terris, John 23rd, that round, happy, fat Pope, directed not only to Catholics, but to all of goodwill, wrote, in this age of ours, which prides itself on its atomic power, it is irrational to believe that war is still an apt means of vindicating violated rights. Now, you might remember that just a few months, this was published in May, the previous October, we had been through the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was October that we were dealing with that presence of Soviet missiles on Cuban soil. We discovered later that we had American missiles in Turkey, and as a result, we were able to kind of work out a negotiation. The Second Vatican Council of the Catholic Church kind of extended this. It said every act of war directed to the indiscriminate destruction of whole cities or vast areas where there are inhabitants is a crime against God and humanity that meets firm and unequivocal condemnation. Now, this was in Gaudium et Spes 1965. This would have been 20 years after the cessation of World War II. And this was a council, as you may remember, that brought together about 2,500 bishops from around the world. And one of the issues they dealt with were modern questions. It was becoming clear that the just war theory that had held in place for centuries was becoming problematic because of new situations. Needless to say, the ban would also include chemical, nuclear, and biological warfare. I think Ron mentioned, and maybe it was George, mentioned mutually assured destruction, which you may recall as the strategy of deterrence during the height of the Cold War. Acronym is simply MAD, and required the possession of vast quantities of nuclear weapons on both sides, land, sea, air. Any aggressor, of course, launching the first strike could be assured that it would be so badly damaged that it would not be, as George pointed out, worthwhile to actually anticipate the first strike. The Catholic Church tolerated the possession of nuclear arsenals on the ground that there were negotiations underway to limit and eventually to limit and then eventually eliminate those weapons. That was John Paul II, a letter of 1982. With the present pontiff, Pope Francis, who's been in office now about 7 years, this really has changed. Not only the use of nuclear weapons, but their very possession is no longer considered legitimate and moral. In his address, November 10th, 2017, nor can we fail to be genuinely concerned by the catastrophic humanitarian and environmental effects of any employment of nuclear devices. If we also take into account the risk of an accidental detonation, as a result of error of any kind. The threat of use, as well as their very possession, is to be firmly condemned. Now, this has been a real break with the Catholic attitude towards deterrence, at least nuclear deterrence, since back in the height of the Cold War. This is now a blanket rejection of nuclear deterrence. Most would argue that Francis did not rule out war as such, but it is quite interesting that since March 24th, the Pope has not once employed the term just war in terms of Ukraine response. He's sympathetic, but he's very cautious about implying that very traditional concept of just war. It is very clear for him, just as his position on capital punishment, his attitude towards war is changing the mind of the Catholic Church. Lisa Cahill teaches ethics at Boston College, and she wrote a very fine work 2 years ago, Blessed Are the Peacemakers, Pacifism, Just War, and Peacemaking. And I think I'll conclude with her remark because it's quite helpful to see the dilemma Christians face. Contemporary discussions bring home the reality that any Christian decision to use or not use mortal force as a last resort to defend innocent lives involves an irreducible moral dilemma. The dilemma consists in the clash of the duty to save and protect the innocent and the common good, as well as the duty to respect the value and dignity of every human life, including that of the perpetrator and of those who suffer the collateral damage of war. What I wanted to just present this afternoon is that the just war theory has been an ongoing developing and changing doctrine or theory about the use of war, at least in a theological sense. I'm not talking about the document International Law. I'm not talking about the material that might be presented in the War College. I'm talking about a Roman Catholic position on just war. And we're standing today recognizing that a theory that had worked for 2 millennia has really kind of reached an impasse. It does not provide an adequate foundation for warfare. Now, this doesn't call into question work being done to try to reduce the number of warheads. I'm fully sympathetic to that. But it would be equivalent, I think today, for someone in the military, equivalent to someone working at San Quentin who would be asked to execute a prisoner. Under Roman Catholic theology today, that would be murder. Very simple. You cannot kill people. So I think there's a corresponding movement taking place in Roman Catholicism, and it's not a dead end because it's moving towards the question of peace building, of justice building. And we find more and more Christians not just sitting back, either standing out of the fray or in the fray, but realizing that for a larger discussion of justice, there has to be more involved work. I work with many international students, a lot of them from Africa. The lingering colonialism, 60 years after the achieving independence is remarkable. Their economies are still dependent on many European powers. So I think in terms of equity and justice, which is a larger question of peace in the world, has to be addressed more effectively and more intentionally. And once again, this is not in any way to question the concern about Ukraine, but there have been armed conflicts going on in many countries of Africa for the last 20 or 25 years, which get almost no attention in the press. And if I can risk a theory, it has to do with racism. It's more important, and I hate to say this, but I'm a white American, but what catches my attention? Whose conflicts become of concern to me? Where does my heart reach out? And which ones do I ignore? Which ones do I pass over in the newspaper or ignore on the news and the TV? So I think this is a call to conscience. If one talking about just war, what is behind the question of conflict? So my reflections tonight, this evening, are just to kind of bring up to date where Roman Catholics stand, at least Roman Catholic official teaching stands on just war. Thank you so much.
And lastly, we welcome Reverend Joanna Shenk.
I invite you to take a breath. This is a heavy topic in the midst of a precarious time. I invite you to take another breath and open your awareness to the presence of Spirit that is among us in this sacred space. Although we may know the Spirit of life by different names, I believe that life force flows through us and around us. It is my prayer that we are open to the movement of the Spirit among us from wherever we are joining this conversation. I know there are people tuning in from far away. So I invite us to take one more breath together. So I am a pastor and I am in a Christian church, so I'm going to preach. So I want to begin rooted in the gospel. Hear these words that Jesus shared with his followers. You have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. This will prove that you are children of God. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that you may have life and have it abundantly. For all who take the sword will die by the sword. In 1527, a group of mostly peasants gathered secretly in Schleitheim, Switzerland. They gathered knowing that if found, they would all be thrown in jail. They gathered to discuss a draft of what would become the first confession of the Anabaptist movement. They were a persecuted minority, hunted by Catholics and Protestants alike for their refusal to follow the dictates of European Christendom. They lived under constant threat of violence in the form of banishment, imprisonment, torture, and death. The sixth article that would become the Schleitheim Confession, the sixth article in what would become the Schleitheim Confession is titled The Sword. It states, violence must not be used in any circumstance. The way of nonviolence is patterned after the example of Christ, who never exhibited violence in the face of persecution or as a punishment for sin. A Christian must love their enemies and pray for those who persecute them, as Jesus did. A Christian should not pass judgment in worldly disputes. It is not appropriate for a Christian to serve as a magistrate. A magistrate acts according to the rules of the world and uses force or orders force to be used, not acting according to the rules of heaven. Their weapons are worldly, but the weapons of a Christian are spiritual. This commitment to love of enemies and nonviolence has remained a core practice of Mennonites, one of the traditions stemming from the Anabaptist movement. It undergirds and continues to inspire many courageous actions for peace. It provides clarity that our allegiance is never to a nation state or the protection of its borders and economic interests. Our allegiance is to Jesus and his way of transformative love, recognizing all people, all nations, as our brothers and sisters, our siblings, for whom we may be called to lay down our lives. This is what it means to follow Jesus. I'm also grateful for the common ground shared on this panel, as we all desire a peaceful world and agree that that is also God's desire for the world. This common ground, however, does not negate the fact that for me as a religious pacifist, nuclear weapons come only to steal, kill, and destroy, and are antithetical to the way of Jesus. The funding of our nuclear arsenal year after year steals billions of tax dollars from programs of social uplift that would bring holistic peace. Shalom, Jesus called it, both domestically and internationally. In 1967, a former Mennonite pastor, Dr. Vincent Harding, penned the historic Beyond Vietnam speech delivered by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He wrote, "A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death." The Congressional Budget Office estimates that over the 2021 to 2030 period, the plans for nuclear forces specified in the Department of Defense's and the Department of Energy's 2021 budget requests, and these could be different now, would cost at least $634 billion. This is in a country with no universal health care, where people working full-time minimum wage jobs cannot afford a 2-bedroom apartment in any state. Furthermore, in 93% of US counties, the same workers can't even afford a modest 1-bedroom apartment. Nuclear weapons come to steal, and they come to kill. They kill indiscriminately, and not just those horrific deaths in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which was 250,000 in the immediate aftermath. A study released in 2017, funded by the National Science Foundation, found that radioactive fallout was responsible for 340,000 to 690,000 American deaths from 1951 to 1973. Even if that estimate is on the high end, let us not forget the United States is not the only country testing nuclear weapons, nor has our testing remained within our borders. We took possession of and then pummeled the Marshall Islands with nuclear tests for 12 years. To this day, we have not taken adequate responsibility for cleaning up the toxic waste left behind. Wherever it is located, nuclear waste will continue to threaten life around the world for thousands of years. Nuclear weapons come to steal, to kill, and they come to destroy. In my research of the US current nuclear arsenal, and of course you can correct me here, George, I found the most powerful bomb is the B-83, designed here at Lawrence Livermore Labs. It has a maximum yield of 1.2 megatons, making it, and research showed different things, 60 to 80 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. 650 B-83s were built. B-83s aside, even a limited exchange of so-called low-yield nuclear weapons would have a significant, if not catastrophic, environmental impact beyond the borders of whatever nations are involved. Some may point out that nuclear weapons could be used tactically and not on civilian populations. But in any circumstance, could we guarantee that would not escalate a conflict? So what is the pathway to peace? The pathway to peace is in the enduring Christian witness, or the enduring witness, Christian and otherwise, against the development, proliferation, and use of nuclear weapons. This is not a marginal position relegated to Mennonites and other historic peace churches. Nuclear pacifism is the status quo among Christian denominations in this country and their global bodies. I found statements of nuclear disarmament and abolition from the General Board of American Baptists. We heard from Mr. Griener, Professor Griener here about the Pope's statement. There's also been statements by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and I definitely recommend reading the statement in January published by the Archbishop in New Mexico, John Wester. The Church of the Brethren also has statements, the Episcopal Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, Mennonite Church USA, Presbyterian Church USA, the Religious Society of Friends, the United Church of Christ, the United Methodist Church, as well as the National Council of Churches and the World Council of Churches. It is my prayer that the Spirit of life continues to break through into the lives of people and communities across the world, awakening us from the lie that nuclear weapons make us safe, and reconciling us as a global body unwilling to allow for any being in our world to suffer that horrific death. I offer one example of the Spirit's transforming power at work in this way, and I offer this because we're in a United Methodist church, this story because we're in a United Methodist church right now. This is the story of Steve Taylor, who currently serves as the Director of Connectional Ministries in the North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church. I will share Steve's story in 3 vignettes. During the Cold War, Steve served in the Air Force and flew on the Blue Eagle Airborne Command Post for the United States Pacific Command. He was on a 2-person nuclear control team whose job it was to relay the nuclear command and control messages and transmit the message to launch nuclear weapons. Steve held this position for 3.5 years. Later, he was reassigned to be the superintendent of the Aviano Air Base Command Center in Italy during the Bosnia-Herzegovinian War. During this stint, he took a team of military personnel to Hungary to build houses with Habitat for Humanity. On this trip, they took a vacation to Budapest and traveled to the top of a large hill overlooking the city. There was a monument honoring the Soviet troops who prevailed in Budapest against the Nazi forces during World War II. Upon seeing this monument, Steve was reminded that Hungary was a part of the Soviet bloc. When I talked with him a few weeks ago, he recounted the experience this way. It hit me that these people whom I loved, with whom I was working, those who were offering me generous hospitality, they were at ground zero for the nuclear weapons I might have controlled. There is nothing to justify the wholesale slaughter of millions of people. This, I knew, was completely antithetical to any Christian message. It was demonic. At that moment, I knew I had to leave the military. Steve left the Air Force in 1995 and became a United Methodist rural missionary. On one occasion, he was speaking at a missions conference where the keynote address was offered by the bishop of the Russian UMC church, an East German named Rüdiger Miner. Bishop Rüdiger gave his keynote from the floor. The cavernous stage and altar were not lit during his message, but once he finished, the lights came up and there were elements for communion on the altar table. Steve had a visceral internal response. I fell apart, he told me. I began to shake and to cry. Finally, after a minute or two, I got control of my emotions and I went forward to receive communion. I went to the bishop as he offered the bread, the body of Christ, broken for you, he said. I can't explain what was going on in me. I had no bones in my body. I knelt down at the altar and wept. Afterwards, I introduced myself to Bishop Minor and I said, I need to ask for forgiveness. He said, do I know you? Let me tell you what I used to do, I said. After telling him, I concluded, if I had been asked to do my job, I would have done it. He just looked at me. He was completely silent. It was a long moment. I imagined he was seeing the fires and utter devastation of nuclear weapons in his mind's eye. He reached over and put his hand on my shoulder. He said, there are men in Russia who have undergone the same struggle you've undergone. They are your brothers. So be forgiven. When I think of forgiveness, that's what I think of, he told me. In 2001, Steve stepped into a United Methodist staff role with the North Carolina Conference. This was the same time that Russia was becoming a UMC conference. He went to Russia along with a delegation of UMC leaders to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the conference and their official recognition within the global body. During the celebration, Steve was introduced to Reverend Dimitri Lee. Steve said, a friend who knew my story told me to share it with Dimitri. He was a towering and broad man. After hearing my story, he started crying and he gave me a giant hug. I'm a big guy, but he crushed me with his hug. Dimitri explained, we were taught to hate you and kill you. And I said, my brother, that is my story too. Dimitri Lee was a retired 2-star Soviet general, and after a conversion experience became a leader in the Russian UMC church. Steve continued, both of us were weeping together in front of the cross. Enemies sworn to kill each other, no longer enemies, now brothers in Christ. Steve told me that his heart breaks to think of the pain coursing through the Russian and Ukrainian UMC churches right now. They share United Methodist Bishop Christian Alsted and are both part of the conference that joined the Global Communion in 2001. I spent 20 years in the military, mostly in command and control, Steve reflected. Ultimately, war never brings peace. It is not possible. Violence begets violence. It doesn't fundamentally change anything. Only love can do that. I claim pacifism so that my people will hold me to it. I don't have the capacity to do it myself. We in the United Methodist Church, he said, collectively condemn the production, possession, and use of nuclear weapons. The existence of nuclear weapons only deals death. We must work to remove them from across the globe. If we don't, he said, one day they will be used. They may be used against the United States, and if they are, we will respond in kind. Millions will die, mothers, children, sisters, brothers, fathers, children of God, non-combatants, innocent people simply living, then annihilated in the blink of an eye. I ask you, Steve concluded, how can anyone call themselves a follower of Jesus, a lover of God, and ever justify such a reality? Truly I say to you, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that you may have life and have it abundantly. Amen.
We can take our masks off for a little bit of dialogue. And Kirby, could you get me the pink mic? I think this one might die on me here in a second. We come to a time of questions, but I also am cognizant of our time as a group. And I believe we're right around 5:20 right now. Is that correct? Yes. If you are online with us and have questions, feel free to submit those. We can pass those along to our speakers. If you are here in the sanctuary, we're going to have a time of refreshments afterwards for about 30 minutes. If you have a question directed to one of our speakers specifically, I'd invite you to maybe flag them down during that time. But I'm just going to ask two concluding questions for us tonight for anyone up here to kind of dive into. And the first one relates to the current conflict in the Ukraine with Russia as well. I'm curious, especially as language around nuclear weapon use is thrown around and movement of nuclear weapons, this sort of heightened state, what sort of off-ramp is present for the globe in relation to the nuclear weapon heightening? Anybody can dive in.
You may have more up-to-date information about the nuclear weapon.
I don't know if I have more up-to-date information. It's been very interesting and very sad to watch this development. The traditional debate, particularly in the West, over nuclear weapons has been the issue of what happens if it escalates to massive levels. And over the years, we've struggled with that because our policy, our guidance, our laws are derivative of the just war tradition of proportionality. We train for it, we target in ways that are meant to meet guidelines like that. But we're not fools. We understand that massive escalation would be horribly destructive. But most of our debate has been at that level. And so when we see nuclear saber rattling coming out of Moscow or Pyongyang, and you wonder, well, wait a minute, this seems bizarre, because they're invoking nuclear weapons use in scenarios that we would never have thought would be nuclear, against small circumstances that we wouldn't think would qualify. Why are they doing that? And is it having an effect? We don't know, but as you can see, they've continued out of Moscow to do that sort of thing with respect to Ukraine. It's having a devastating effect because, as you know, Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons, and this is sending a particularly bad signal internationally in the non-proliferation realm, where people are beginning to wonder that if we're going to live in a world in which you have regimes that bully with nuclear weapons in all kinds of scenarios, maybe we need to get them too. But there's another dimension here, and it goes, I think, to the heart of your question, which is we had, partly as a result of the evolution of international law, developed the notion of the responsibility to protect. You've heard some very good presentations on why humanity would think in those terms. And the expectation was that the international community, in the name of justice, should find some developments in other countries so egregious that the international community should act. And in Ukraine, with these gross violations of international law, the expectation was that the Western democracies would react strongly. And yet, there's been a tremendous amount of reservation about what to do, not to get involved directly and to be very cautious. Well, of course, if you're dealing with nuclear threats, you do need to be very cautious. But how do we get the balance right between not over-responding and not inviting more death and destruction? Because remember, it's not just Ukrainian kids that are dying and Ukrainian civilians that are dying, but the Russians are sending off large numbers of conscripts to die, young kids. We should love our enemy. We should understand humanity. But we also got to figure out, how do you put a stop to it? And I think the off-ramp here is basically to stop the aggression and make it clear that some other path simply has to be taken because aggression will not succeed.
Thanks. Anybody else have anything they want to share?
Just a comment about two states, North Korea and maybe Iran. I think they're playing deterrence in reverse. North Korea is actually not a strong state. And I'm not supporting North Korea, that isn't the point. But as I analyze, why would they want to develop a nuclear force? I think because they know they're surrounded by very powerful forces that are contrary. We teach a lot of Korean students at the school, and I think one of the issues they face is that, have we been right at their neck at the DMZ for the last how many decades since the Korean War, and does that unsettle North Koreans themselves who want to stay in power? This is just an interpretation. So I can't say more than that about this. But deterrence can go both ways.
Anybody else want to dive in on that one?
I think we're facing two other countries who are seeking admission to NATO, and as NATO becomes a more surrounds the Soviets more and more, this will be considered, I think, as a provocation. They're already reacting by threatening to cut off gas and oil and so on. So it's a real touch-and-go issue. For local security, the Scandinavian countries would want to be part of NATO, but it also is a provocation to the Soviets. So it's really tricky to figure out how to negotiate that.
Well, our final question before we head outside, Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4, articulates a prophetic vision from Isaiah where swords are turned into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. To the question of the forum, are nuclear weapons necessary today? I'd be curious on each of your reflections on what this scripture means to you and how this sort of prophetic vision can be enacted within our world.
I mean, I certainly understand and hope for that eventuality. my own perspective is modified by the nature of humanity. I mean, as much as we may profess, peacefulness and kindness to others, which we all certainly do, there are nation states, sub-nation organizations that don't have that same view. And to turn swords into plowshares fundamentally requires everybody to be on the same page. It ultimately has to do with, in Christian terms, the nature of sin. We all have. And the fact of the matter is there are, people in the world who take advantage when you're not strong.
I think the work that Ron had been doing, talking about START agreements, destroying weapons. During my doctoral studies, I was living in Germany, 15 miles from a United States nuclear weapons depot, Pershing II cruise missiles. So I felt, I felt the proximity of nuclear weapons. So when that was resolved, that was a major relief, not just for my German friends, but for myself as well, to think that tension at least had been resolved by lowering. But see, and the same thing, to be honest, when I grew up, I didn't realize that we had Jupiter missiles in Turkey. Well, we had them, and finally, after the Russians pulled them out of Cuba, we kind of dismantled those in Turkey. So it's kind of tricky to figure out who's threatening whom and who feels threatened. And I think part of that is anybody who feels threatened feels they should be defensive. And we're not the only ones who feel threatened.
So I was thinking, and thank you for that question, I was thinking about the Beyond Vietnam speech again and how Dr. King referred to our country as the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And so I think we also have to take account of the way that we're viewed on the international stage and the acts of aggression that others have perceived us to take over the history of the American imperial project. So I think that's just one thing that I want to offer, that we don't just get to be the good guys. And the other thing, because of this specific verse, I want to mention a movement that, if you're not familiar with, is definitely worth looking into, the Plowshares movement, which took their name from this passage. And this was begun in the 1980s by the Berrigan brothers, Philip and Daniel Berrigan, doing nonviolent direct action focused on nuclear weapons and the nuclear arsenal. And there's been over 70 actions since the 1980s that they've participated in. And there was one that I just wanted to note because it's, I think, fairly exceptional, but I think is also a helpful lesson. So on July 28, 2012, 3 Plowshares activists, including Sister Megan Rice, who was 83 years old at the time, breached security at the U.S. Department of Energy's Y-12 National Security Complex in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, causing the government to temporarily shut down the weapons facility. Although many news organizations called it a break-in, the team, including their lawyers, were clear that they walked in. There was one article that described it this way: nestled behind a forested ridgeline on the outskirts of Knoxville, Tennessee, is the sprawling Y-12 National Security Complex, America's Fort Knox of weapons-grade uranium. The complex's security cameras and machine gun nests are designed to repel an attack by the world's most feared terrorist organizations. But they were no match for Sister Megan Rice, an 83-year-old Catholic nun armed with nothing more than a hammer and bolt cutters. In the dark morning hours of July 28, 2012, Rice and 2 fellow anti-nuclear activists bushwhacked to the edge of Y-12, cut through 3 separate security fences, and sprayed peace slogans and human blood, you can read more about that if you want, on the wall of the building that is said to hold enough weapons-grade uranium to obliterate human civilization several times over. They remained inside Y-12 for more than an hour before they were detected.
I want to add one quick footnote to something you mentioned about perceptions. I spent 7 years in a small village in Germany and got to know some of the people there very, very well. At 9/11, I got a phone call from one of the Germans, first to apologize for what happened, but then he said, you know, you had it coming. And I was so startled. I mean, I knew him well, but from the perception of many, even allies, we are not always perceived as the good guy on the block. So I think it's very important to be attentive to perceptions. Perceptions are incredibly important, not just from our enemies, but also friends as to what we do. As I say, I was stunned by that, and I thought about it for a long time. It really made me rethink what I thought about myself.
I've spent a lot of time working on what I guess one would call swords into plowshares. And in particular, spent a lot of time in the states that were part of the former Soviet Union. I worked very closely, in particular, with scientists who were involved in their weapons programs, all of whom are patriots. Many are strong nationalists, but all of them extremely intelligent, and in my experience, with a strong sense of wanting to do what's right and wrong. But not always understanding everybody else, just as we didn't always understand them. But I was struck by a number of things, which was that we were always better off if we sat down and tried to establish what is it we really care about and what is it we really know and what don't we know. And there are a number of things that jumped out at me that were, I think, very important to your question. So I'll give you an example. I asked one of my Russian counterparts one time, why are you always nuclear saber rattling at the Swedes? Because they're neutral. And his answer was, well, we fought almost a dozen wars with the Swedes, and they've stolen our heritage. And I said, well, what? Well, see, I hadn't yet really known about this anti-Normanism movement in Russia, about revisiting the early history of the Kievan Rus and the role of the Scandinavian Vikings, or whatever you want to, Varangians, whatever you want to call them, who were coming down the river trade and who were involved in the early formation of what became Russia. And there's an attempt to rewrite that because somehow the Swedes are stealing their heritage. And I was a bit surprised at this. And yet one of his colleagues would say to me, and this was in the 90s, the time has come for Russia to join NATO because the Chinese are going to be the problem. We've always been invaded from the east. We've always been able to manage the invasions from the west. And yet another Russian say to me, you know, we love you Americans because the Europeans think you're just a bunch of cowboys, and they think we're just a bunch of cowboys, and we can be cowboys together. And you know, you say, what? I could go on, but the problem we have is that you pick your point in history, and everybody has a grievance against almost everybody, but mostly your neighbors, because they've been closer to you. I was in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, when it was still Yugoslavia in '87. And I went out to coffee with a group of Yugoslav artists and intellectuals. And Tito had died, and I asked the question, has Yugoslav man been created? What's the future of Yugoslavia after Tito? And the answer was unanimous. We don't think of ourselves particularly as Yugoslavs. I'm a Serbian artist, he's a Bosnian poet, this is a Croatian sculptor, whatever. But we're sure of one thing. We know the consequences of the breakup of Yugoslavia. It will be horribly violent. Therefore, it will not happen. I mention this because it's easy to say we need to bring justice, but it takes a process, a long time, to deal with that justice. And how do we deal with it when somebody says we're taking violent action now? And when I look at Yugoslavia, you can say all you want, this was the arrogant West imposing its morality on the people of Yugoslavia and picking sides, or whatever your argument is. On the other hand, the rest of Europe was saying, wait a minute, we thought we had left this barbarism behind. Why is this back? Shouldn't we do something about it? And that's why they deployed military force. And when the UN couldn't do it, they turned to Nato. So that's the world we're dealing with. It isn't that everybody has to take a military stand. It isn't that the military response is always the right answer. But you've got to figure out what you're going to do, because bad things do happen. And we have to know how we're going to deal with them. And maybe it is we stand aside. And I agree with George. Sometimes we stand aside and we say, well, why? Well, it's because we don't know those people very well. Whereas people we know, we stand for. One of the reasons that two traditional neutral countries, Sweden and Finland, want to join NATO is they don't want to be the country that's forgotten, that says, like Ukraine, well, they were outside the alliance, it's tough on them.
I would just add one further point. Heaven knows the United States has made lots of errors and made lots of difficulties, many bad decisions that, are too many to enumerate. I think it's important to remember on the positive side that we have also created or tried to create an international order based on the rule of law. We have pushed for globalization as a way of connecting people across the globe. Heavens knows, I'll display my politics. The previous president didn't have that point of view, but I think generally speaking, this movement forward of a society based upon international rule of law that's globally connected, and that's a good thing. And rather than forget that, we should build on it. And it has taken a set of characteristics of this country, some of which we've talked about today, in order to create that situation. And I think that's, generally speaking, been something that moved in the right direction.
Well, can we give a hand to our speakers?
We'll talk about canon law.
Yeah. Thank you to those online for joining us and listening to these 4 wonderful presentations and our brief discussion. For those of us here, we invite you to refreshments out in the courtyard. You can take your masks off out in the courtyard and enjoy conversation with our speakers and one another. Thank you for coming.